Thanks, Betty. I'm happy to sort of give a preview here of the work that I did with Eric Hedberg, actually, of NORC, looking at data from successive waves of the National Endowments for the Endowments surveys of public participation in the arts, the SPPAs, they call them. The first one of which was administered in 1982. And they were administered again in 1992, 2002, and 2008. So we had data sets from 4 different surveys of pretty large representative samples of the American people to work with. When as Betty said, when the National Endowment released the data from the 2008 survey, they announced with some concern that the evidence from the survey was that arts participation, by which they largely meant how many people bought tickets to go to see the theater or listen to a concert or enter a museum, what they refer to as benchmark arts events, i.e. the things that NEA grantees present by and large. Not exclusively, that's not all they looked at. But that was the principal focus of the SPPAs, that benchmark arts participation had been declining on a consistent basis since 1982 and had reached its lowest level in 2008. Now, some of you, and actually I'd like to see a show of hands, some of you are maybe aware that over the last couple of weeks, Rocco Landesman, the chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts, has stirred up quite, well, he's the chairman who kicked the hornet's nest. He's stirred up quite a controversy with some remarks. This was one of them about the SPPAs. The NEA's 2008 SPPA survey found a 5%, quote, decrease in arts audiences in this country and a 23% increase in not-for-profit arts organizations, a rate of growth for nonprofit performing arts organizations that was 60% greater than the total US population. And then he concluded that anyone who hears these two numbers has to ask about balancing the equation, which means either increasing demand or, yes, maybe decreasing supply. How did you measure the increase in You have to ask him. I'm just quoting.
I'll show. Saying if you measure it by, for example, like IRS filing or something like that, then it wouldn't be really accurate because so many people, incorporate, so many organizations incorporate, and then they never, they stop operations.
Absolutely right. However, he was working with real data. He wasn't making this stuff up. And the truth is that there were those that incorporated a long time ago that didn't operate, and those that incorporated more recently that didn't operate too. So he was talking about the best data that he had available. The trouble with a lot of data in the arts is that it is pretty dirty. He sort of compounded the issue when he made this remark: demand is not going to increase, so it's time to think about decreasing supply. The result of this was that a sort of explosion on the little universe of the arts blogosphere. There's been a succession of posts and responses in a lot of sites, including the New York Times site, about these remarks. Lots of controversy, a lot of hurt feelings, a lot of outrage that the chairman of the NEA should think we can't increase demand. But he's, like I said, he's talking about real data. Now, I don't know if you're going to be able to see this. Can we maybe darken the lights a little bit more for just this slide? You can see on this, these are the art forms: jazz, classical music, opera, musical plays, non-musical plays, ballet, and other dance. Those are the art forms that constitute, and last is art museums and galleries. Those are the art forms that constitute, quote, benchmark arts events. So these are the things that they've been primarily concerned with. And if you look at the end of this column, you can see that every one of them, except art galleries and museums, is down by double digits from 1982 to 2008. Some some, ballet in particular, and opera, are down by 30 and 31%. So whatever our quibbles might be with the data that Landesman was actually talking about, there's a problem. And it's pretty clear from this data that it's a serious problem. Okay, so in 1992, after the 92 SPPA, the NEA commissioned us a report to look, from researchers who looked at the relationship of arts education and arts participation. And this was the principal finding of that report. They found that in the 1992 SPPA, arts ed was the strongest predictor of almost all kinds of arts participation. Those with the most arts education were also the highest consumers of and creators of various forms of visual arts, music, dance, drama, literature. So when we got the contract to do this new study for the NEA, we decided that this was going to be our first research question. Was it the strongest predictor of adult arts participation consistently across all 4 waves of the SPPAs? Are there trends in arts education that we could detect? Sure. Can you still see? It's okay? Okay. What are the trends in arts education? Has it increased or decreased over the years of the SPPAs? And has childhood arts education in particular contributed to or mitigated declining arts participation among adults? So those were our 3 research questions. Yes. It is a powerful predictor of adult participation. And you don't need to know the percentage marks on these data points, but what you see here is a comparison of adults who had studied at least one art form as children, who also in the last year participated in at least one benchmark arts event here. These are adults who had no arts education as children, and whether they participated in at least one benchmark arts event in the last year as an adult. Okay? So what you can see here is that by a margin of about 2 to 1 fairly consistently across all 4 SPPAs, people who had had any arts education as children were much more likely to participate in the arts as adults. And what you see here is adults who've had some arts education as adults in college or post-college, and those who had none as adults. And again, it's in this case the margin is more than 2 to 1. You're more than 2 times more likely to participate in the arts if you've had some adult arts education. So,
is the arts education defined as being in school, or might it be outside of school?
The questions, I mean, this is more evidence of how difficult it is to work with data about the arts. The questions in the SPPAs, first of all, they varied from year to year. So they were tough to compare, but second of all, they were also what you really would think of as coarse-grained data. They asked people, the question on most of them was, have you had any classes or lessons in music as a child? In some cases, they asked about particular ages as a child, and in some years, they asked whether the classes were in school or out of school. But in most, they did not ask whether they were in or out of school. So what we knew was, if somebody said yes to that question about music, that they'd had some sort of music class or lesson before they were 18. That's all we knew. They might have had recorder lessons in 4th grade for 6 weeks, or they might have had private piano lessons at home once a week for 12 years. We don't know. They said yes to that question. That's what we know.
But it was only music in all years?
No, they asked all the art forms in all years. And so this is the difference between, this line represents people who said yes to any of the art forms. If they had more arts education, and by more in this case what I mean is that if they had classes or lessons in more than one art form. They were also more likely to attend than people who had fewer classes or lessons, studied fewer art forms. And this is the line that shows those who had none, those who had one, those who had 2, 3, 4, and all the way up to 5 art forms. Arts education is also positively associated with personal creation and performance. In other words, going to the arts as a member of the audience is not the only way you can participate in the arts. People play the piano or the guitar, they sing in the choir. So these graphs describe the relationship of arts education to those practices as adults. And again, we see the more childhood arts education that people had, the more likely they are to perform or create, which is the language that the SPPAs use. I want to introduce you to somebody. We had to figure out how to measure the strength, the relative strength of arts education against other variables that have an impact on arts participation. So we created a hypothetical baseline person, and we named that baseline person BP for the purposes of the analysis. And BP is not somebody who's very likely to go to the arts. He's a white male, he's young, 18 to 24, he's married, he's working, he's got a high school education, he had no arts education as a child or as an adult, and he's not well-to-do. He's in the lowest socioeconomic quartile. In 1982, the first wave of the SPPAs, there was a likelihood that he was going to attend the arts, one of those benchmark events, of only 12.5%. But as you can see, from 92 to 2008, the likelihood of attendance declined from 12.5% to 8.8%. So BP's the declining likelihood of BP attending the arts reflects the broader decline in arts attendance among adults, arts participation among adults. So then we began to change some of the other variables. We took a look at age. And what we found was if BP were older, he would be more likely to attend. So you can see here that if BP were between 25 and 44, he would be a little bit more than 11%. It would be the likelihood of attendance. So there's some movement dependent on age, although it's not terribly dramatic. I mean, even if BP were over 55, there'd still only be there'd be less than a 14% chance that he would go attend a benchmark arts event. He would be more likely to attend if he or his parents were better educated. And each of these, this is the standard, 8.8%. That's BP in 1982. If he had less than a high school diploma, he'd only be 6.2% likely to attend. If he had a college degree, he'd be 18.3%. So education's got a lot to do with it. Parents' education has something to do with it too. More parent education, more likely to go. Not nearly as dramatic though as his own education. If he were wealthier, he'd be more likely to go. But our conclusion was that arts education was the most powerful influence on benchmark education, on benchmark attendance. Studying just one art form as a child led to an increase of almost 50%, 8.8 to 12.5%. Studying two almost doubled the likelihood of attendance. And somebody who studied 4, we didn't have data on 5 because, frankly, no BPs studied 5. But as you can see, the trend line goes up for the more that somebody studied. Now, keep in mind that what I said before, we don't know exactly what we mean when we say they studied the arts. So I'll get back to that in a few minutes, because it strikes me that there's likely to be enormous variation between the people who had 6 weeks of recorder lessons and 12 years of piano. But we can't penetrate that through the SPPA data. Okay, I guess I already said that. Yeah, Joanna.
One more question.
Sure.
So when you look at those education trends, are you controlling for income too, and vice versa?
Yeah.
Okay. Did you find any sort of deflation in your effects? Like, for example, when you controlled for income and didn't control for income? Because I know that income is a predictor, and then education is a predictor. But if you're
Income and education is also a predictor of income.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you control for income, I guess education is a stronger predictor, but if you control for education, the effect of income actually deflates because.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if you saw that as well.
Yeah, we did. But you know, the relative strength of the two, education was
much greater.
yeah. So the next question was, are there trends in arts education, and in particular, are there trends in childhood arts education that might have an influence on adult participation? First thing that we took a look at was the 18-year-olds in each of the survey waves to determine how many of them said that they'd had childhood arts education. We kind of considered those 18-year-olds the most reliable sources of data because they didn't have to remember as far back as some others, for one thing. And this was the first thing that popped. In 1982, almost 65% of the 18-year-olds said that they'd had childhood arts education. By 2008, it was under 50%. That's roughly a 15 or 16% decline, but in terms of the rate of arts education, it's much more than 15%. A drop of 15 or 16% from 65% is almost a quarter fewer kids are getting arts education in 2008 than got it in 1982. That's pretty dramatic. Well, I've also talked to you about this, haven't I? Okay. Now, what we did though, we took it one step further, and this is what we found. Because remember, this was a cross-section of the American people that were surveyed. So they talked to old people in 1982. Somebody who was 70 in 1982 was born in 1912. Their childhood happened from 1912 until 1929. So they had pre-Depression childhoods, and we had enough of them who at least claimed that they remembered whether they'd had classes and lessons in the arts. That we could track how much of the young population was getting arts education across much of the 20th century. So starting here in 1930, we can see less than 25% told the NEA that they had gotten any arts education as kids. But the line goes steadily higher until here, roughly 1984. Where it peaks out at about 60 or 65%. That's an increase of about 180%. Now, all these circles are data points, and the line is the trend line that sort of basically averages the data points. The filled circles are the 18-year-olds that you saw the slide from before. The open circles are all the other data from other ages. So you can see then that arts education has gone down again since about the early 80s, and shows no sign of turning back up, at least not yet. I wish I knew what slide this was by number. Oh. Okay. Oh, yeah, one point about this slide. This kind of almost right angle that you see the line taking is not terribly typical of social development and change, which is often more gradual. When you see a line that looks like that with a sharp angle in it, it's likely that it suggests that there was some precipitating event or events that, that caused the change. And I want to talk in a little bit about what I think those might have been. In fact, I'm going to talk about it now. These slides sometimes surprise me. Why the decline? Well, first of all, in the late 1970s and in the 80s, we had the combination of what we now look back on and call the tax revolt against the costs of public services like education that made cost cutting necessary. The most sort of notable of those was, in terms of the tax revolt, was the passage of Proposition 13 in California in 1978. But across the country, school districts were cutting budgets because of their own fiscal crises, independent of the tax revolt. They just didn't have the money. There were big structural dislocations in the American economy. We're still seeing them. That were affecting cities like Chicago, which was losing its manufacturing at an enormously fast pace, and in the process also losing its tax base. The schools went broke. In 1978 in Chicago, Chicago laid off all of its elementary school music and art teachers. Same thing happened in New York City in 1976 and in many, many other large districts across the country. That was an important dimension of that, the turn in that line. There was also something going on in education in terms of thinking about education and educational policy. And I point specifically to the publication of an important report in 1983 called A Nation at Risk, which was a report that was commissioned by the Department of Education under President Reagan, who, you might remember, campaigned to eliminate, which was what was at that point a very new department. It had just started in 1979 under President Carter. He campaigned to close down the department and instructed his Secretary of Education to take care of that business for him. Instead, the Secretary commissioned a blue ribbon panel of private sector experts who wrote this report about and investigated the question of whether there was a federal role in education. You know, the federal government has historically played a very limited role in education. And their conclusion was that the states were failing, that there was what they called a rising tide of mediocrity in the schools, and that the problem was a crisis. It threatened national security, and that it demanded federal action. And so all of a sudden the federal government actually did start to play a role in school policy. The problem was that the report, which I think did a pretty good job in many respects of analyzing the challenge in the schools, the report from the perspective of arts education didn't pay any attention. The arts are barely mentioned. The report basically argues that the schools were kind of adrift as far as curriculum was concerned, that there was, I think the language that they use I think is pretty interesting. They say schools are filled with appetizers and desserts, and it's hard to tell what the main course is. Presumably the arts were one of those appetizers and desserts, because the main course, as far as they were concerned, was what they called the new basics. The new basics were basically the old basics: reading, writing, arithmetic, science, social studies, and they added one new twist: computer science, you know, because computers were just then, 1983, just then beginning to be noticed in education. The arts were pretty much off the agenda. They acknowledged that it was a good idea for students who were deeply interested in professional careers in the arts to have the opportunity to take pre-professional training in high school. And that was about it. We then looked at how that decline that we saw was distributed among American kids. Here's where I think, in a certain sense, we found the most surprising and difficult material in the data. Maybe can you shut the light up again? I want you to. You won't be able to read these; they're too small. But I want you to be able to at least see the lines. The green line at the top is white kids, 1982 to 2008. Very little change really over that time, 59.2% to 57.9%. This black line in the middle are African American kids. In 1982 it was 51%, in 2008 it was 26%. And this bottom line is Hispanic kids. In 1982 is 47%, in 2008 28%. So what you can see is that the distribution of the decline is profoundly unequal, and that it's almost all of it is being carried by Black and Latino kids. That's who's lost arts education over those years. And we took a look at what art forms were they studying or not studying, right? And there were differences, as you might expect. In 1982, 53% of kids reported had taken some music classes or lessons. By 2008, 37% had taken music classes. So that's a big drop for music. 36% had taken visual art. 26% had taken visual art. Pretty big drop for visual art. This line here is creative writing. Pretty significant drop for creative writing from 21 down to 12%. And these two bottom lines are theater and dance. And as you can see, actually dance rose before dropping again in 2008, but even in 2008 was slightly higher than it was in 1982, as was theater. In other words, dance and theater actually went up, so most of the decline was in music and visual art. Now, music and visual art are, of course, the two subjects that are generally most available in schools. Dance is very infrequently taught in schools. Theater is sometimes taught more often than not. Theater is the drama club or after school, it's much more common for kids to take music and visual art classes in schools. So this data set would suggest that the drop mostly happened in schools, which would suggest that those budget cuts and and the ideology of what's important in school that was expressed through Nation at Risk are likely to be correct. Those were the causes of the drop. Okay, so I've already told you this, and I've told you that. Here's the next question, and this is a tricky question. What's the relationship of these declines in arts education to declining arts attendance among adults? And I think that I probably wouldn't go as far as Chairman Landsman has gone to say that if we raise arts education, we will raise adult attendance down the line. I don't think we know enough about what kind of arts education has that effect and how much arts education has that effect. I think what we can say is that the decline in arts education is likely to be among the causes for declines in arts participation. But I think we also have to admit that there could be many, many other causes. New technologies and new media and the internet compete for scarcer leisure time. That's a likely cause. The arts themselves have changed and as the traditional distinctions between art forms and the traditions of cultural hierarchy have eroded, partly as a result, of course, of the efforts of artists to erode those hierarchies. So as a result, in a certain sense, the SPPA's concentration on benchmark events as a measure of adult arts participation may actually be too narrow to capture the range and complexity of adult arts participation, but it does show something. It shows that I would say that some arts education has a causal effect on adult benchmark attendance, and that arts education also has strong relationships with other forms of arts participation. I would argue that it would be important to identify what kinds of arts education has those effects. But I would also say that those of us who care deeply about expanding opportunities for kids to learn the arts ought to be very careful about saying that the reason that they should learn the arts is so that they grow up to become arts participators. It seems like a kind of self-serving, yeah, thanks. It seems like a pretty self-serving kind of argument, and I think if you become, the more familiar you are with kind of the politics and culture of schools and school reform, I think you'll quickly realize that it's not an argument that's going to be particularly influential in the schools. What the schools care about is, are the kids learning to read and write and compute, and can they pass the damned standardized tests? And that has been kind of the terrain on which the arts have had to justify or failed to justify their presence in the schools over these last 30 years. The other thing is, I think it's fair to say that causality in this situation may be bidirectional. In other words, the decline of the arts in schools may be the result of the loss of interest in the arts. You know, adults just aren't that interested in the arts. That's evidence of that is simply the fact that they don't attend as much as they once did. Maybe that's one of the reasons that they think they're less important in schools these days. And I already mentioned that education, arts education, different kinds of arts education is likely to have different kinds of effects. So thanks. That's my report. I'm happy to chat, take questions, whatever is on your mind or puzzles you at this point.